starring Thomas Mahan, was shot on location in Alberta. It was an honest effort to depict the hardships of the Western Canadian homesteader. It is ironic that this well-made film raised the hackles of the Prime Minister of Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie King. As Mr. King plodded through the snows of Ottawa, he brooded on the fact that a film called The Canadian was filled with foul weather and economic disaster. He asked that the title be changed to The Pioneer Canadian, presumably on the grounds that such things may have happened in the old days, but they certainly didn't happen anymore. Another politician was making a more positive contribution to the cinema. He was W. Hearst, Premier of Ontario. Back in 1917, Mr. Hearst had established one of the first government film agencies in the world, the Ontario Government Motion Picture Bureau. This was one of their first films, and their subsequent efforts were in the same vein. The product was aimed largely at the education and enlightenment of the Ontario farmer. The Bureau soon expanded and took over the bankrupt Trenton Studios. In the meantime, the federal government in Ottawa had also set up a motion picture bureau. It was aimed at encouraging tourism and attracting industry. The tree was heavily featured in early Canadian documentaries, and the Canadian cameraman became the world's leading expert on the photographing of wood and wood products. Another Canadian specialty of the 20s was the nature film. Canadian cameramen went to great lengths to properly capture the wildlife of the Dominion. Another art form of the silent cinema was the writing of cute little title cards to brighten up the films. Perhaps the best of the nature cameramen was the intrepid Bill Oliver of Calgary, who did most of his work for the National Parks Department. Oliver would do almost anything to get his shot. Scaling cliffs, building towers, or digging pits in the path of a herd of buffalo. Oliver did much to make the Canadian naturalist Grey Owl internationally famous. His movies on the English beaver expert who posed as an Indian were seen all over the world. Perhaps the most famous Canadian movie star of the silent era was an authentic Eskimo called Nanook. In 1921, Robert Flaherty created the documentary classic, Nanook of the North, which is still screened somewhere in the world almost every day. The American Douglas Burden brought an anthropologist from New York to guard the authenticity of another film. Silent Enemy, shot with the Ojibwe Indians around Temagami in northern Ontario, was made with meticulous attention to authentic detail. Using no professional actors, it told the story of a tribal drama. Although it may have been the best film on Indian life ever made, it had no stars, and hardly anybody has ever seen it. In 1927, the Trenton Studios once again became the focus of the Canadian film industry, with the formation of Canadian International Films. Premier Howard Ferguson of Ontario, concerned with American domination of Canadian culture, made a strong plea to Canadian businessmen to invest in the company. The response was gratifying. Among the investors was a former Canadian Prime Minister, Arthur Mahan, and the man who would soon become a Prime Minister, R.B. Bennett. To write and direct the first production, there was a big name from England, Bruce Bairnsfather, the most famous cartoonist in the world. His first World War character, Old Bill, was known throughout the British Commonwealth and Empire. The film was to have a World War setting, and the heroes were to be Canadians. Bairnsfather tooled up the Trenton Studios for the big production. Many of his actors and his technicians were Canadians. One of these was Gordon Sparling, a Canadian who'd been in New York learning the feature business from Walter Wanger. Sparling joined Bairnsfather as an assistant director.
Unfortunately, Bairnsfather didn't know much about the business. He was an artist, quite a sense of humor. He was a shy, retiring sort of a man, but he had a good sense of humor. He had the feeling that people were ready to steal his comedy ideas, so that there was never visible a script. Nobody ever had a script during the whole picture. Theoretically, he had one in his pocket, but my feeling is that beyond a general outline, he made it up more or less from day to day.
Sparling was ordered to build a working model of the Belgian town of Ypres. He spent 3 months constructing an elaborate model, complete with walls and buildings that would collapse in a puff of smoke. The model was never used in the film, and this was typical of the production. Bairnsfather's inexperience led to useless extravagances that soon pushed the costs 100% over budget. If nothing else, the film was being made in the grand manner.
Everything was done on a much more elaborate scale than you could possibly do it today. For instance, the big gas attack at Ypres, 200 Pullman porters, colored boys, were brought up from Montreal and dressed up in Senegalese costumes in a special train. They were fed and housed there for 2 or 3 days. The battlefield where the gas attack occurred had been an old sawmill ground, so that the ground was soft enough to dig trenches easily. The background was of a ruined, shelled village. Today, to reproduce that one sequence in a film would cost probably as much as the whole film cost then.
One of the extras was supposed to be a dead German, and he was getting $5, so they said they'd give him another $5 if he would lie with his head in a puddle of water. And he thought this was very nice. But the trouble was that it was bitter cold December, and by the time the focusing had been done and everything rehearsed, there was ice actually forming on the puddle, and the poor fellow had to break the ice to get his head out.
The film was called Carry On, Sergeant, and it opened at the Regent Theatre in Toronto on November 10th, 1928. reviews were mixed. The Toronto Star was full of praise. Other critics attacked this scene between the Canadian sergeant and a French cafe girl, arguing that it should not be suggested that the Canadian soldier would engage in sexual intercourse out of wedlock, even under the most trying circumstances. The sergeant in question paid for his sin by leading a noble charge into the jaws of death. That may have saved his soul, but it didn't save the picture. Every evening, people were rushing off to the movies, but nobody was rushing off to see Carry On, Sergeant. The film ran for 2 weeks in Toronto and a week each in Brantford, Trenton, Kingston, and St. Catharines. That was as far as it went. The most opulent Canadian production ever made died a miserable death at the box office. The reasons are not clear. It was certainly not the seduction scenes, which should have sold tickets. It is true that the talkies had just arrived, and this was a silent film, but most of the world's theaters had not yet converted to sound, and silent films were still packing people in. It was argued that it didn't show Canada in its traditional robes of ice and snow and scarlet Mountie tunics, and therefore it had no international appeal. It was also argued that the Americans who owned the majority of Canadian theaters were not particularly interested in promoting a product which did not come from one of their production studios in Hollywood. Thus ended Trenton's dreams of glory. The silent film era ended on a dismal note.
When sound came along, then the days of a man's camera were gone, because you had to have all sorts of heavy equipment. You had to have a large crew. You had to shoot your scenes so that the sound of the camera was masked. In the earliest days, they were using booths, which were on rollers, and you rolled them around so that the sound man could see what was being shot. The old-timers used to say that the fun went out of making pictures when sound came in.
However, it was in Newfoundland in 1930 that a brave early attempt was made to liberate the sound film from the studio and bring it out into the natural world. A courageous young American documentary filmmaker, Varick Frizzell, raised the money for a dramatic talking picture to be shot entirely on location in Newfoundland. He would tell a dramatic story against the background of the great Newfoundland seal hunt, using a handful of professional actors, mixed with hundreds of Newfoundlanders who were asked to play themselves. It was a revolutionary undertaking, and Frizzell called it The Viking.
Oh, the Viking! That's the ship I'd like to sign on.
That's Captain Bob Barker's ship, and he only takes the best men.
Unfortunately, the leading professional actors, Charles Storrett and Louise Huntington, were monumentally incompetent, but even they could not detract from the sheer documentary power of the film.
How do you like it, Vi? All right? Well, I guess we'll be getting along all right.
Mary Joe wanted me to be keeping an eye out for you.
You needn't bother about that, Skipper Jed.
What are you trying to do, make a fool out of me in front of the men?
The story concerned itself with two rivals for a lady's hand, who find themselves out seal hunting or swiling on the same ship. The hero has a reputation as a jinx or jinker, which he has to live down.
Luke Orham, who in the devil gave you a berth on this ship? 30 years have I been to the ice, and I've never lost a man. And now I'm swiling with a jinker.
All together, boys! Roll over!
Well, I'll be sorry.
All right, boys, come in, go!
These scenes, shot in the North Atlantic, are all the more remarkable when one realizes that not one man in 100 could swim.
Get up, I tell you. Up on your feet. Walk, man, walk. Or we'll freeze. But we're on a pad. I can feel the drift of it. Not at all. Now then, here ye are. Now what? Let's get going. You've got to make it, I tell you.
The villain, stricken snowblind, loses the ship, but is led back across the ice floes by his noble rival to the safety of St. John's. This final scene was shot in the historic Quidi Vidi Church in St. John's, but only after the clergy assured the nervous parishioners that filmmaking was not the work of the devil.
Jed, he's outside.
Oh, Luke! Oh,
Where's Luke?
He's all right, Skipper Jed. Don't you worry about him.
This makes twice you've saved Luke Orham's life, Skipper Jed.
Are you wrong, my son? This time, it was Luke that saved my life. I'm one of those that called Luke Orham a jinker. But when the sight comes back to me eyes, I'll whip anyone who says Luke Orham's a jinker.
When the film was finished, Frizzell was dissatisfied with the dramatic sequences and returned in the spring to do some reshooting. While at sea, the ship exploded, and 27 persons, including Frizzell, were killed. The film was released without improvements, but with an introduction by the famed Sir Wilfrid Grenfell.
And while we must humbly bow our heads to the inscrutable will of Providence, which took Derek Frizzell and his companions from us. We may console ourselves somewhat that they first accomplished their self-appointed task.
Despite the publicity, the Viking had limited success at the box office, and the company was heard from no more. If you didn't make it in the theaters, you didn't make it anywhere.
In the earlier days, you only had 35 millimeter, no 16, and your only audience was the theater. You couldn't, there were no film societies, no film festivals, no film award shows. The only way to get your picture seen by anybody was through the theaters, which meant that you had to make it so that it would appeal to the theater managers. And if you didn't, you just didn't get your picture shown.
And who controlled the theaters? In the early days, it was the Allen brothers, who'd come up from the States in 1906, and by 1920 owned 47 theaters across Canada. But the Allen brothers were about to meet their match. Two of the Hollywood giants, Adolph Zukor and Jesse Lasky, had embarked on a relentless campaign of theater acquisition across North America. Zukor already controlled a huge movie studio, Famous Players Lasky, and a vast distribution network, Paramount. Now he wanted movie theaters to complete an interlocking empire for the production, distribution, and exhibition of films, which would enable him to corner a good chunk of the billion-dollar movie business. In 1920, Zukor moved into the rich Canadian market with the formation of Famous Players Canadian. For a time, it was ostensibly Canadian-owned, but it was effectively operated by Zukor and his Canadian lieutenant, Mr. Nate Nathanson. Famous Players went right after the Allen chain. The Allens responded with a brave expansionist policy to meet the new competition, but they were soon overextended and forced to sell out to Zukor and Nathanson.
They started again. They tried to acquire whatever theaters they could, and they kept acquiring theaters wherever they could. And eventually they were so big that Mr. Nathanson didn't want them to be a threat to him, so he made a partnership deal with them.
By 1923, Famous Players had 60 Canadian theaters and distribution rights from almost all the Hollywood studios. Famous Player theater managers were treated royally. There were annual junkets to the Paramount lot in Hollywood to meet the stars and the starlets. Meanwhile, the independent theater owners stayed home in Canada and watched miserably as yet another Famous Players picture palace went up across the street. A picture palace which would get the cream of the Hollywood product while the independent took the leftovers. When one Canadian independent wrote to the head of Universal Pictures, Carl Laemmle, asking for the rights to one of his films, Laemmle replied that even he was, as he put it, more or less at the mercy of Mr. Nathanson. Even Nathanson's friends and colleagues admitted that he operated with a singular ferocity in what was a very ruthless business. By 1929, a small group of independents were sufficiently desperate to go to war with Famous Players. One of them was Nat Taylor of Toronto.
He didn't acquire all the theaters by any stretch of the imagination. But what he did do was acquire the important theaters in the key cities right across the country, so that if a distributor wanted to get the most money, he really had to go to Famous Players first, because they were the source of the greatest revenue.
It was 1930, and Famous Players now controlled 207 Canadian theaters, or approximately 1/4 of all the movie houses in Canada. Their power extended far beyond that. They were in all the best locations, and they got all the best pictures, and unlimited promotion resources were available to them.
Well, eventually, because we were having trouble, Earl Lawson managed to get Ottawa to investigate, and they eventually brought a case against certain people in the business as a